Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, and I'm hopeful that the enthusiastic response I received is translated into action. So I want to call the panelists forward and the moderator for the next panel, and I'll be joining this panel as well. And we will continue to build on this theme of what time is it on the clock of the world.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Wenzel-Fisher, and I am going to be your moderator today. I live here in New Mexico, and am really grateful to be at this event. I work at the Thornburg Foundation, which is a family foundation headquartered in Santa Fe and serving New Mexico. I work with grantees in the space of land and agriculture. And I've learned so much here, and I also feel like that was a really hard act to follow, so I'm just getting myself organized. All right, so I think what we're gonna try to do here is dive a little bit deeper and maybe more practically into many of the things that Baba Malik just shared with you all. I was gonna do a little bit of framing for this panel, but I think that he just did a lot of it. But I have a few things to say about that. Before I dive into it, I also just wanna say a little bit more of thanks. I want to thank all of you for being here. I think this is one of the biggest audiences that this particular forum has had, and it's amazing to have so many funders and practitioners, and it's like palpable, the learning that's happening as a result of that. So thank you for being here. Good job, Claire and company. You've organized an amazing event, and as a conference organizer, I can say that because I'm kind of highly critical. I also want to say thanks to Maya and all of the staff here who are cooking and serving and cleaning for us. You are seen and is appreciated. And I wanted to say thanks to the Pueblo of Santa Ana for having us here. It is an amazing community. I learn new things and am inspired by the way that they work and take care of one another. And so just a word of gratitude to the broader community where we are as well. So as we were preparing for this, some of the topics that came up were about how we are in a really different place today than we were the last time that this forum was held. The world felt like it has been turned upside down in the last 4 months, and I think we're all trying to understand how to navigate, and I think that like right now is a moment when like there's a sort of funny tension, right? The narrative has not necessarily changed, but I think that there's a growing awareness that the story we are telling, the way that we are thinking, and the way that we are making action is gotta shift, and we have to think faster. So that's some of what we're gonna talk about today. Also, as we were organizing this, Samir said, backcasting to 2015, if we knew then where we would be now, how would we have acted differently, and what would we have funded? Which I found to be a really profound question and thing to chew on. So the topic of this panel is, what time is it on the clock of the world now? I want everybody to hold that question as we're moving through here. I also will invite you, for those of you who have phones and are engaged on the app, if you want to answer that question in the questions part for this panel, would love to see it. And I'll also say, as we're diving in, at the very end, we're going to take questions both from the audience but also from the app. So if you've got a question that comes up as we're chatting, please put it there. Also, it'll be a place for everybody else to see the questions, so even if we don't get to them, we all get to read them, which I think will be nice. Another piece that I've been thinking about, which I hope we're going to dive into here, is what are the assumptions that we make about the broader relationships between government, philanthropy, the nonprofit sector. I think there's a lot of ways in which we are talking about our work that assumes that those things are going to be the same, and I think that they are changing, and we're at a moment to be proactive about fixing things that don't work, scrapping things that never worked, and reimagining and leading into building systems that we actually want to have. And all of that is sort of predicated on those like larger institutional relationships and how we operate within them. So the last thing I'll say is that the purpose of this panel is to make you all a little uncomfortable. And if you leave without something that's kind of, you know, making you squirm in your seat a little bit, maybe we haven't done our jobs, but uncomfortable in a good way, right? So how can you leave with something that just sticks with you and inspires you to think differently and behave differently? We also hope that it will get the fire in the belly going, or the fire under the ass, as was the case in the conversation while I was here, and that you will feel inspired to take what you learned, not just from this panel, but in all the relationships that you have reaffirmed or created while you are here, and leave and put them to work. So that's what we're up to. Now what I'm going to do is turn to our panelists and invite them to introduce themselves. Across the stage, we have Samir Doshi, Paula Garcia, Dania Davies, and Baba Malik. But I'm going to let them introduce themselves in the way that they would like to today. These are going to be kind of long introductions, and then we'll dive into more of a dialogue. So I'm going to start with Paula Garcia.
Buenas tardes, desde Dios. Good afternoon. My name is Paula Garcia, and I'm a Chicana from here in what we call present-day New Mexico. And I come from a long lineage and an unbroken chain of farmers in the land. And my ancestors came from Mexico during the 1700s. And I also have ancestors that are Pueblo and tribal here from present-day New Mexico. And in this present moment, I have a lump in my throat from the images of seeing the military occupation in Los Angeles. And I'm trying to move that lump in my throat to my heart and my gut and that fire in the belly to have the courage and the resolve to fight fascism. And that's where I am in this moment. And the way that I wanted to introduce myself and connect you to place is with this idea of querencia. And here in New Mexico, we have a concept of querencia, which is love of the land and love of place. And I grew up surrounded by gardens, and I was blessed to be around grandparents and parents who grew gardens. And the really formative time in my life was when I was invited to go home through an AmeriCorps program, to go home and work in my own community. And my grandparents were in their 80s. And during that time, I started a reintegration with my ancestral practices of growing corn. And I grew corn with my grandparents for the rest of their lives, so for most of my 20s and 30s, and until they passed away. And it was the most rewarding thing I did, and I've carried on that practice to this day. It was an overlap where, when I say that unbroken line of farmers, it almost broke because my parents became wage earners, and my grandparents were living off the land completely. So I feel like I had that blessing of that overlap of time with my grandparents. And that informed the rest of my life. And since then, and for the last 30 years, I've been working with the New Mexico Acequia Association, where I've been the executive director. And during that time, and let me tell you what an acequia is real quick. An acequia is a community irrigation system. But it's more than that. It's a community. Acequia is the waterway that brings water to the community from the river, but an acequia is a community. So I would say, yo pertenezco a la acequia. I belong to this acequia. It ties back to this idea of querencia. And we manage water or share water through customs that are rooted in values of equity and sharing and fairness and honoring water as sacred and as a life giver. And during that time, and by the way, the acequia, that word is of Arabic origin because the tradition is rooted in part in the Moorish time in Spain that was brought to this continent, but also is informed by and rooted in the indigenous practices here and the ancient agricultural practices of the pueblos. And during that time, I've been playing offense and defense. So, and in terms of defense, it's been protesting the commodification of water and recovering from climate disasters. But on the offense or proactive side and dreaming and building and creating is supporting farmers, revitalizing local food systems, and putting that water into practice communally and recommunitizing water in what I see as an arc and thinking about that, what time is it? And looking in this microcosm of New Mexico of trying to relocalize and recommunitize and redemocratize water from a time that we viewed it as communal and as a community resource to the commodification of the 20th century. And now in the 20th century, in our culture and practices, but also in our policies, recommunitizing water and land so that we can uplift agriculture from a values-based perspective and not from the values of capitalism, but our values that are of humanity and culture and love and community. And that's my introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Thanks for being here. I'm going to have you pass your mic to Dania. Oh, I didn't realize that you had one. There you go.
Hi, everyone. I really wanted to play a soca song, but it just doesn't work with the flow. So I am originally from the island of Jamaica, and yes, there's a whole contingent here. And I also, my ancestry, in terms of my introduction, I always have to think about my ancestors. Because when I think about the world clock, I think about the construct of time and the construct of the colonizers' time being imposed on our indigenous ways of knowing time. And also, as a person who, my grandfather moved from Hong Kong to Jamaica because of British colonization, and the warnings that my mother and my aunt and uncles were given about the hazards of being swayed by the commercial gains, the material gains of the colonizer. I really, that's a powerful calling I have to remember that I've already lost a language of my ancestors. I have no access to any version of any Chinese language at all. I can barely pronounce my great-grandfather's name. And so when I think about fascism and I think about time, I think that for some folks, this is a tolling of a clock, and for some folks, this is a clock that has been polyrhythmic, circular. Like this is kind of old hat in the ways that many of us have already encountered entropic fascism. So entropy is the final stage of fascism at which we're all limited on our imaginations about what things could be if we didn't live within a fascist paradigm. So when we start preemptively complying, that is part of how it becomes entropic, when we get too afraid to give ourselves to the solution, when we forget the humanity and we forget that a generation prior, right? Like, I could have spoken that language. And then I have African ancestors as well, obviously. And so being a person who is biracial and from Jamaica, like, I always had like this fantasy of like who my ancestors were. So I feel like I got to kind of like also claim Grace Lee Boggs and Jimmy Boggs, because duh. And then also, like, we have our first national hero of Jamaica is Queen Nanny. And for those of you who don't know, the Maroons were the Africans that were welcomed into indigenous communities with the Arawaks and the Tainos and the various other indigenous ancestors throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. And I always hold Nanny kind of as my North Star, because for me, Nanny went to war against the British and won. Right? And it wasn't just Nanny, like, that's the name that we have, but Nanny and the other liberated Africans liberated themselves, but by interconnectedness with the Arawaks. And so that to me is the story of America. Like, and that to me is how I feel like I fit into that story. But just a little bit more about me is that when I came to this country as a child, I knew I wasn't welcome. There was no illusion that I ever had that I would be welcome, because I came in the 80s, and folks don't know that, the US empire was getting really concerned about how our prime minister was aligning Pan-Africanism and democratic socialism and aligning the Caribbean with Cuba's liberation of their island. And so our democratic process was overthrown, and the gun violence, when I tell people I'm going back to Jamaica, they're like, do you feel safe? And I say, well, do you feel safe? Because the guns that come to Jamaica, the guns that come to Jamaica come from America. The school shooting epidemic that America is experiencing, I think about a quote my mother always used to say when I was a child and I didn't do something I was supposed to do. And I experienced, that consequence. And she would say, another same day leaf drop in the water, it rotten. And that literally means it's not the same day that a leaf falls into the water that it starts to rot. So the consequences of having not taken action when indigenous peoples were crying out in defense of Mother Earth, when African peoples were crying out in defense of Mother Earth, when those two were coming together to hazard Europeans about what fascism does to our ways of knowing. Because feudalism was trash. And some Europeans don't know their ancestral practices, their ancestral languages, when I was homeschooling my child, we learned about every single goddess from every culture around the world. And it's really important that right now we're in a spiritual reality. We're in a spiritual awakening, and that time on that polyrhythmic circular clock that our indigenous ancestors, they're calling us, and I know you all hear it, because I know, I do feel like I'm a little bit, my mental health is probably not awesome, but I also feel like there's so many ways in which there's a spiritual reckoning. There's a spiritual leaf rotten in the water right now. And we're all suffering collectively under that. And so as a biracial, I'm bringing a warning to you all. I'm bringing the caution that, and this is gonna be a deep share, and so I apologize if it's a trigger warning. I sit almost every single day with thoughts of harming myself, almost every single day. And that's, not something that a lot of people who follow, you might know me from Land Loss Prevention Project or the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund, Land and Liberation, WTF. And it's not exactly the one version of WTF, it's We're the Future. That's really what WTF is. And so I just want to bring a caution that that spiritual disconnect that we all had to assimilate away from to gain proximity to wealth and proximity to power and proximity to white supremacy. None of us here in the sound of my voice, anyone that we care about, anyone that we serve, any institution we've built our allegiance to is safe in this moment. And so I have paid the price of losing my Chinese language, my African language, my Jamaican accent, right? So I'm telling you as a person who's getting more grounded with the realities that the ancestors and the indigenous peoples of my ancestry are calling forward, that I introduce myself including all of you because I'm a mirror, and I'm cautioning you all that time is running out and we can get into entropy if we don't take action together right now.
Dania, thank you for your vulnerability and just a little love to you. Baba Malik, would you like to say some other things about yourself? You shared a lot before, but you also said you're in a moment of transitioning things, so I invite you to give a little more introduction if you'd like to.
So I don't want to say so much about myself. I want to, again, speak to the time period and just the urgency of the time that we're living in. And I want to call people really to be fearless. I mentioned that in my talk. Kwame Nkrumah said the secret of life is to have no fear. And often, I think that the reason that we don't more vigorously oppose oppression is because we're afraid of the consequences. And so this is why it's important that we're grounded in our spirituality, so that that spiritual grounding is more dominant in our minds than the fear of what can happen to us, our fear of losing jobs, of losing a car, not having a house, losing money or whatever. Our spiritual grounding has to be greater than that. A very important part of the Black Arts movement was a group called the Last Poets. And they had a poem where they said, "Blessed are those who struggle, for oppression is worse than the grave. It's better to die for a noble cause than to live and die a slave." So I'm not on some like revolutionary suicide thing. I'm not suggesting people go out and die, but I'm suggesting that you have to stand so strongly for what you believe in and for what you represent, and what you believe and what you represent should be aligned with this greater spiritual flow. And if you are in tune with that, then you can stand fearlessly in the face of what we're saying. So I just want to put out a call for people to be bold and fearless, particularly those who have their fingers on the levers of power or the pens that write checks. I want to encourage you to be bold and fearless. This is not 20 years ago. We're in an unprecedented time, and it requires people to really step up in a very serious way.
Thank you. Samir?
Greetings all. I'm just taking a breath and holding all that was shared. Thank you all so much for that. My name is Samir Doshi. I've been recently kind of reconnecting with my tribal history, and it's been a tense sort of journey because I want to dip into it, but there's a lack of access in many ways. So I come from Kutchi and Katwadi peoples in Western India, and just invoking a lot of what my lineage has been through in the past several centuries. And I look forward to kind of being in closer relationship with that. I I'm going to speak a little bit more from my funding role at CS Fund. So this is my first philanthropy gig. I've been at the foundation for 3 years. I was a grantee partner across a few different lines before. And it is a wild transition, as some here know. I lead the program on just transitions. It is both a domestic and global program. We focus squarely on community power and self-determination, and we fund in different regions around the globe. We try to accompany a vast different array of expressions of what that looks like. You know, we can call it sectors, or we can call it a lot of things. On the ground, it's all the same work. But from arts and independent journalism to climate justice to food sovereignty to feminist action to solidarity economies, just ways that communities are really trying to build into self-determination. And we have a pluralistic praxis on transformation. We recognize that cultures all around the world have different frames and interpretations of it, and there's just a rich tapestry when we really try to decenter a Western funder coming in with Western ideas, even from movements that are grounded in Western dominant culture. And just recognizing that and kind of some of the contradictions that we're moving in and out of when we start looking at a global form of solidarity. There's a framing that we also try to ride with of an understanding of the extraction and the extractive history of philanthropic wealth, that it's been thrice stolen. And so we're talking about stolen land, stolen labor, and stolen capital through exploitative capital market systems in a global economy. So even though we're talking about US wealth, it is extracted from each different part of the globe. And so again, from our framing, like that solidarity comes back to what does it look like being in right relationship with movements from across different regions. There's a couple of ways that we're showing up currently that I just kind of want to invoke and engage in with others. We started a Fighting Fascism fund after the election. So before the inauguration, before we're starting seeing a lot of these executive orders and other things coming through, we have a lot of partners that we funded during the first Trump administration that have been heavily targeted. So the fund actually has it's grant-making dollars, and it has an accompaniment with protection, defense, and tending. So we provide physical protection for a lot of our communities. A lot of folks are being disappeared in the US and then also around the globe. Economic and legal security, digital security, which honestly our movements and our foundations are very poor in. Like, it's just real talk. We are very susceptible in that sort of way. Sorry, am I mumbling? Sorry. My wife tells me that too. I'm just gonna excuse myself a little bit. I have a 3-year-old and a 7-month-old at home, and came in with very poor sleep, and I'm just recovering as we're trying to be here. So I'll give myself some grace for that. The other sorts of things that we're trying to do in showing up, we often hear from our partners in the South that we can't go through a just transition for the global North on the backs of the global South. And so in the climate justice space, we have really stepped into green extractivism and the role that transition minerals plays in all of our technologies, including now farm technologies and others. But what does it look like to actually have a full material supply chain that is post-extractive, and leaning into that? And then most recently, we'll talk about this in a little bit on the political analysis, we've set up a new organizing and funding strategy around technofascism and really taking on big tech, and saying that even progressive philanthropy, again, is really behind in terms of all that we're up against.
Thank you. All right. Thank you all for those long introductions, and I'm going to try to move us sort of quickly through a little bit of a flow here. So where I wanted to go first was just to, I think each of you has shared a little bit of analysis of this moment. We are in a moment that is unprecedented, but I'm curious if there's anything in particular that you all want to share about where are we on the clock of the world right now. And I think maybe particular attention to, as we are looking at like significant potential paradigm shift, and at a moment where those who are most vulnerable are at the highest risk of being targeted, and when we're, I think, at a moment of like risking factionalization also. How are you holding these ideas, and is there anything else that you haven't shared in your introduction in terms of your analysis of right now that you want to bring up? And you don't all have to answer, but if somebody feels called to do that, you can.
I wanted to give an example from when I was in law school, which was, I won't tell you how long ago, but I will say that I went to the University of Virginia School of Law, and I was in a course where the professor posed to the students in my course, you know, do undocumented peoples deserve human rights? And I was not the only Black person in the class, but I was the only person for the entire hour-long session that said yes. I was the only person in the entire session that said yes. And the professor was actually a Black woman, and she asked me to stay after class. And I sat down, and she just, after everyone left the room, she just burst into tears. And she said she could not believe the things that the people were saying to me to my face about how I don't deserve human rights, right? I mean, you know, the community that I represent to them does not deserve human rights. You think of people saying those things like hypothetically behind closed doors or whatever, but no, like this was, she said it was one of the most horrible things she'd ever witnessed. And she said, but she just didn't cut it off, because every time someone made a point, like I had a counterpoint to like every single thing that was said. And so I want to share that because it was almost 20 years ago. And so when I hear things like, you know, we're in a different time, you know, I'm really, I don't know that I'm convinced. I don't think that I'm sold on that we're in a different time, because I think that it's just that the people that were okay to feel that they could be the sacrificial lambs of our version of consumerist capitalism and lack of democracy, it just wasn't as visible. It wasn't as, you know, social media accessible as it is today. And so, you know, some of you may know me from the executive order tracker. Because, you know, and I also have a course that's on YouTube called What to Expect When You're Expecting Fascism. Spoiler alert, we're here. But I will say that, you know, when I started tracking the executive orders, it's really important to me, like, as a lawyer, that, like, who's going to actually, like, read these things, right? And Grace Lee Boggs actually talks about how, you know, we think that democracy is, like, every 4 years. We think that democracy is, like, you know, getting a piece of legislation passed. And then we just outsource the decision-making power to who we've elected to represent us. And the accountability is only when we vote them in and out of office. But that is part of, we're all complicit in not holding systems accountable. We're all complicit in saying, I just can't work with those people, whatever those people are for you, right? Because I work with a lot of folks in the South. My whole career has been in the South. And there are a lot of folks who we all know vote against their interests politically, because change is what gets, distilled down to folks. So it was really, really important to me to be the nerd that sits with these documents and put out, this is what the language says, this is what it means, this is the type of things that we're gonna see happening. And so I kind of started building that on January 20-something. And then Mark Miller from Regenerative Ag Fund was like, can I share this? And then I had some clients that asked if they could share it, and then it just became like 1,000 people like that were subscribing to get this information. But what I want to remind us as funders and frontline leaders is that it's really important that what's different is that what SAFSF has been funding to get passed, especially from the federal legislative perspective, like those are our wins. Like the community-led funds, LIFE and EFOD and National Black Food and Justice Alliance, SAMIA, like all of those, like those are our legacy, like as an SAFSF, right? Like those are the things that we know are a part of the solution, spreading democratic decision-making to the people who are most physically impacted by the realities of the inequities in our food system. And so I just want us to remember that, like, we've been doing what needs to be done, and we need to remember that Grace Lee Boggs also talks about, like, we need a critical mass. We don't need, you don't have to be the one reading the executive order and teaching the class, although if anyone wants to, please let me know. I'm happy to pass this on. But I do think that it's important for us to remember that the work doesn't end with your nonprofit job or your funder job. It continues to calling your representatives, to being in the streets, to bailing people out of jail, to giving folks mutual aid and mutual defense. And you're not a separate thing from the way that we defend democracy in our society.
Thank you. I love this idea that there's a really palpable connection between defending democracy and actually building the muscle, like doing democracy every day. It's not every 4 years. It is, how we make decisions in our organizations every day. And yeah, really like leaning into that and making sure that we have the muscle seems so important. Does anybody else want to sort of lean in on the sort of analysis point before I move us to the next one? Go for it.
Yeah, I just had two reflections to dig into it. So the first is, Baba Malik said, roughly 60 to 70% of the world currently is under authoritarian rule. And we had a historic year of elections as well. Over half of the globe voted in federal elections last year. We also know that there has been huge amounts of resistance to anti-authoritarian rule all across the globe. And food sovereignty movements have been at the forefront of that in so many places and spaces. So for us here domestically, there's a lot to learn from movements across the globe in terms of how to face these different forms of fascism, different forms of control and power. And it's an area I think that those bridges across global majority communities have to really been dug into. Another reflection is just connecting some of the dots that you laid out. Doge and the office of Doge was half-staffed by staff from Palantir. I don't know, does anyone know who Palantir is? Raise your hand. So this is basically the largest data militarization in the world that was formed by Peter Thiel, who is PayPal bros with Elon Musk, who is also the installation of J.D. Vance for basically the past 20 years. These are long-term plays. Palantir has a major contract with the DoD, and that data and information and the advanced AI that's used, the most advanced AI that's being put out right now, is being experimented on in Palestine. Direct connection again to Palantir. Palantir also has the major data contract with ICE, which is providing them information for Los Angeles, for Minneapolis, and all these other forums. The Waymo cars are data collectors that get sold off to police departments. You know, shout out to Shakir Rahman and Stop Spying LAPD. So the understanding of the play that they are making, like Elon Musk is kind of a distraction, and he's purposefully a distraction to these major fascist plays that are being moved through techno-fascism, and it's a global play. It's happening in communities all over the world, but it's coming from these entities in our backyard. So then when we come back to the philanthropic and funder response, we're not going to have food justice if we don't have human rights. If you don't have democracy, if you don't have the rule of law, if you don't have the right to dissent. And so it requires this space in this room, and especially the funding community, to bridge more with democracy funders, with human rights funders. You know, check out the Block and Build Coalition, funder coalition that's stood up by a lot of progressive philanthropy, Rising Majority in the resource mobilization space. Again, looking at like what are the specific plays from the funding community to combat authoritarianism. The United Frontline Table as a movement of movement and member alliances is a space where more food movements should start integrating more into. As someone that funds and is active in those spaces and is trying to accompany those movements, this room is really needed in those spaces. Honestly, it's a lot of urban organizers. Like, again, I'm being like very real and transparent. It's a lot of urban organizers around urban issues, and so rural issues and land-based issues and organizing, and that acumen is a missing space in that community. And I would say there's a corollary to this space as well. Like, we really need to be in formation. There was talk earlier about solidarity in the earlier session. Solidarity with each other in all these different ways and forms. And it comes at a basic rights and a basic organizing sort of level. And then we can move through the different forms and ways that we're going right now. But there needs to be more bridging.
Did you say there needs to be more vision?
That too. I said there needs to be more bridging.
Great. Okay, thanks.
I have thought about I come from a very, very rural area, and you know, we're 100 miles from Santa Fe, where the nearest protests are, you know, and so I was talking to my son, who's 22, who's going to be a lawyer. I'll talk to him about and getting some inspiration from you, and we're like, are we going to go all the way to Santa Fe for the protest on, the, you know, No King's Day and all this, and you're right, we have to be in it every day, not just in our work and as the executive directors, organizers. Like, we have to be immersed in this anti-fascist movement and pro-community. So what I was observing over the last couple of days was at the last minute, a group pulled together a protest in a smaller town, you know, like 30 miles away. And you know, it was grounded in the mutual aid networks that formed after our climate disaster. So 3 years ago, we had the worst wildfire in New Mexico history. You know, burned 340,000 acres. That's in my community. And I mean, after COVID, you know, 2 years of that disaster, and then this was right on the heels of that. And so in the wake of those fires, and then the burn scar flooding, there's been mutual aid networks form around firewood, around, you know, food banks and groups like Neighbors Helping Neighbors, which, you know, they're not even a nonprofit, they're under a church, but guess who started disseminating the flyer, like, hey, let's have a protest in our little town, and just thinking about how we meet people where they are, you know, and how, you know, where people are is in their communities and the needs of their communities. And I think the the main lesson I learned from those fires is that we shouldn't wait for a disaster to form those mutual aid networks. And it's not always going to be in the nonprofit sector. You know, there's like deep community, and those are the places where really meaningful organizing can take place. So I think back to how are we making sure that democratization is happening in a really radical way at a very local level, and how it's grounded in survival. Because here in New Mexico, we're dealing with climate change in a very intense and acute way, very intense droughts. The water crisis is worse than anybody realizes. And we're mining groundwater, we're in a mega drought, and then we get hit with these wildfires. And I think about the Pueblo Revolt. We opened this conference with the Pueblo Revolt, and that I'm grateful for the people, all the Pueblos who rose up to fight back against empire and make sure that there was a strong indigenous peoples here in New Mexico, what's present-day New Mexico. And that revolt happened in large part because there was a drought. And the Pueblos felt like, the Spanish Empire brought in an imbalance and they need to be expelled. And I wonder if we're in another Pueblo Revolt moment, Is it this time like where things are out of balance, and how do we mobilize for survival? And this is a survival time. And at the same time that we're talking about basic survival, which in a rural area, it definitely feels that way. In that basic survival, how is all of that energy and work leveraged also to fight fascism and fight for democracy? And I see pieces of that emerging, and that gives me hope.
Thanks, Paula. All right, we're going to move to some questions from our audience. I have them on this lovely tablet here, and thank you, all of you who are putting questions into the app. So it's time for commitments. What can we ask foundations commit to collectively and succinctly before we walk out of this room?
So I spoke to some of those things in my talk. I don't think I need to repeat those. But again, it's a question of will, and it's a question of people being bold and fearless. So I think we know what needs to be done. It just needs to be done. I think I heard Samir yesterday say, cut the check. And I hate to be gross and mundane, but really, we've got folks on the ground who are doing the work, who know what needs to be done, and they're under-resourced, and we need money, not in trickles, right? And really, this funding game, it's a game, frankly. It's a game. It's based largely on who you know, who you're in relationship with. Did you go to college with the program office, or whatever the case may be. And so we need to stop with all the nonsense, right? And I'll kind of switch to another thought and connect it to this thought, and that is that Malcolm X once said, if you have a problem, you look around the world at people who had a similar problem and what they did to solve their problem, and you'll know what you have to do to solve yours. And so one of the things that, as we look around the world at oppression, so we are in unprecedented times, but oppression is not new. It's manifested in various ways across human history. And one of the ways that the oppressed fight oppression is by building united fronts, by building unity. And so I would say we need a broad unity that is focused on the principles of justice, equity, and self-determination. And that requires some personal work, because a lot of times, even within our movement, as you say, we have contradictions, and we can be petty, like, I can't work that person. They didn't speak to me 10 years ago, Well, we need to get rid of all of that and realize that we're in a fight, and we're really ushering in the next level, the next era of human development. And so we're kind of the stewards of that. And as such, again, we need to be bold, fearless, decisive, and I'll put a period there.
Thank you. I like this idea of like being the doula of ushering in, what's coming next. That's what we're doing here. So the next question I'm going to do here, but if any of you don't have the app or haven't put in a question there, we're also going to have somebody with a microphone walk around if you want to raise your hand and do it the old-fashioned way. So the next question is, how do we move beyond the current cycle of isolated 5-year organizational strategic plans to create a genuine 100-year collective vision for our food, I'm going to add a word, water and agriculture systems, and who holds the process? And the context of this is, given the transformative social change from ending chattel slavery to toppling dictatorships has historically required decades of sustained and coordinated effort. And I will just say, you know, like, I'm proud of New Mexico. We have, there are entities here who are thinking that way. They're like, how do we create a 50-year, 100-year water plan? But in this particular space, what would your response be to how do we think longer?
So I kind of let the cat out of the bag when I talked about Queen Nanny. Black women best, right? Like, I think some of what we're seeing in terms of not being super organized in the past couple of months is because we've burnt Black women leaders out by not investing in their leadership. And specifically, you know, I wouldn't be in this room right now if it weren't for Kolu Zigbee, if it weren't for Dara Cooper. And I just want to name those things of like, I recognize that Black women, given their positionality within democracy or the lack thereof in the United Statesian context, have always had to build solidarity economies. As a matter of fact, I do have a, you know, since the UN and the US are not respecting international law, I have put out a mutual aid and defense compact because I think it's going to take us remembering that we defend us and we support us. But, you know, the way that life and, you know, the other groups, but a very good example, if you've not been following the work of the Southern Black Farmer Community-Led Fund, I really think that that is a long-term vision. And I want to kind of a little diversion, but, you know, standing on the legacy of the Federation's revolving loan fund and the Land Assistance Fund, a lot of what the Federation did around financial support was coming out of when philanthropy completely retracted from supporting the Federation, because for a moment, their civil rights work in their personal lives came under investigation by the federal government. And instead of stepping up and stepping at their sides, a lot of funders, all of their funders retracted support, and the staff at that time had to go and live in Epps, Alabama, on the training site that the members had built. And so the way that the Southern Black Farmer Community-Led Fund has included the Federation and the Alabama State Association and the Mississippi Association of Cooperatives and NIA's farm. Like, these are the people making the decisions, because as farmers, as Black farmers in the South, they know exactly how much technical assistance they need to get access to credit. They know exactly how to run their businesses, and they know that they have to rely on interdependence within themselves. And so, you know, I'm very inspired by Indigenous peoples who think about 7-generation plans, but I want us to just remember that, like, you know, the community-led fund structure that Life and those groups that I've named have been doing that work already. It's like we have the blueprint. And so in the ways that, you know, my background is in public health, and when you think about public health, it's like, how do you make the most important choice the easiest choice? And for me, it comes down to, you know, if we center the needs of the most vulnerable, if we center the solutionaries of the most vulnerable, then you get the curb cut effect. Everybody benefits from the most vulnerable peoples being centered. So if trans peoples, if immigrants, if Black women, if disabled, visible, and other and invisible disabled peoples are being centered in the ways that we show up to support organizations, then we get more than a 100-year plan, because there's a track record of those solutions circulating in community for over 100 years already. So it's science-based. It's like, how much more data do we need to know that the solutions exist? We just need to put our money where our mouth is.
I'm really feeling like this element of navigating contradictions. And so I kind of want to challenge this a little bit. And I also want to note, just when we talk about the most vulnerable people, I like saying the least protected people, because it's not by their own agency that they're the most vulnerable. It's we as a collective are sacrificing trans people, Black women, Palestinian children. It is an active practice of not protecting. So the element of like navigating contradictions, I think we have a need to protect our communities in the current form of exploitation, and at the same time transform the conditions that are exploiting them. Meaning that we have to move assets and infrastructure and all of your capital stacks and card games to communities. And if you don't shift to a post-capitalist, post-extractive economy in 20 or 30 years, the next 70 is meaningless. So again, like, this is a contradiction, that land back, reparative land acquisitions and transfers further capitalism, right? Like, you can't hide that under covers and under like poetic language and aspirational thinking. It is not, we are not going to spend our way out into liberation. We are not going to move community-controlled funds and assets and start managing exploited capital to a transformative state. It has to be something completely different. And so the challenge then is like, what is that route look like? What is the work to say that we need to think at a bioregional scale and not just at a parcel scale? Because every time you are acquiring a parcel or a building or whatever else, you're increasing the speculation surrounding it. Even if you put that in a trust and then that's out of the speculative market. There's no such thing currently as non-extractive finance. It just does not exist. You are operating within an extractive system. There is some form of extraction that's happening there. And so that is a contradiction that we have to engage in. It doesn't mean that we stop. And specifically for funders, you cannot act perfectly. You cannot sit in strategy meetings and do 5-year strategy plans and improve on these sorts of things. Again, we have the current responses and practices to move forward to protect our communities as they are. And then we need to listen and have a full-on conversation led by movements, led by communities, in terms of what does a transformative state look like? What is beyond this?
Thank you. Yeah, what is beyond this? That is the question. Okay, we're going to take one question from the audience, and then I'm going to ask you all to give some closing remarks. Do we have a microphone out there? Do we have somebody who wants to? All right, Holly's over here. Tasha's over here. Who's got a question? I can also just ask off of here if nobody wants to raise their hand. All right. And I know you're going to have a good question, so.
Thank you for your time, your dedication. But I want to answer a question with a question. And Dania said, why are we doing this for the 5-year plan, et cetera? And I say, who said we have to? According to who? Said who? And up until when are we going to maintain those frames that limit us on the things that we know in our heart, in our minds, that we must do? So, to me, is according to who and up until when. Thank you.
Thank you for that beautiful question with the question. Does any of you want to speak to sort of how do we move beyond the frame and who?
I have a quick thought. I don't have an answer, but something along the lines of my colleague here. We were talking about the framing, and I was reminded that we had a funder once that said, "Can you put a dollar amount on the policy wins that you have?" And it wasn't so much the 5-year time frame, but it was like the economic monetization of the work. And so we tried to add up all the acres that are on acequias, on 700 acequias, and do a dollar figure on the and it was just, we couldn't do it. We're like, we think it's $3 billion. I don't know. It was a big number, and we just felt funny. It felt really did not sit right. It was like against every fiber in our being to have that dollar figure. And I think it's like according to who, like what kind of metrics are we talking about success, and the way, we try to quantify our progress in like policy wins. We changed the framework, we changed the laws to say that we're treating water differently, more as a community resource and less as a commodity. And the way we were trying to frame it in terms of values was, in this many years, we worked with 500 acequias, and every single one in their organizational documents had a value statement, like water's our lifeblood. We don't want to sell our water. We can't legislate love. We can't legislate querencia. We can't pass a law that makes people do a certain thing. But in our cultural and spiritual grounding, and that's where a lot of our work has to be grounded in spirituality, because it's the belief system and how we treat each other and how we form that relationship to the land that's really going to take us in that 100-year frame. And yeah, and the value of that, we'll never be able to buy it under the current capitalist system. But if everybody has a mindset that says, I would never sell my water for $1 million, because now we have that conciencia, concientización, that view of private property was an imposition through manifest destiny. And our ancestors knew that water's life, water's not a dollar value. And if we hold that collectively, that has tremendous power. And that'll take us over a 100-year time frame, but not the economic metrics that capitalism dictates for us.
Thanks, Paula. That was a beautiful response. All right, we are very close to, we have 2 minutes. And what I'd love to do is 2 things. One, for those of you who are using the app, I want to ask you, if you feel so inspired, to add there, what did you learn while you were here? What is making you uncomfortable from this conversation in that good, growing way? And what are you committing to doing as you are leaving this forum? What is your commitment? So that's my ask to you all, is to add, if you feel so inspired, to the app. And then I'm going to look to all of you and I'm not even going to pose a question. I'm just going to say, in a sentence or two, reflecting on the conversation that we've had here, call to action or a question that you'd like to pose to folks here as we leave.
First of all, thank you to my fellow panelists. You all are brilliant, and thank you to those who stayed in the audience. I want to build on this theme of building unity, and again, I say unity has to be principled. And so one of the things that often stands in the way of building this kind of multiracial unity is the fact that many, many, many white people are not willing to do the work of ridding themselves of internalized white supremacy. And so when black folks and people of color come in the room and we see that manifest itself, we be like, we don't even want to deal with that nonsense. So if we're serious about building a movement for justice, equity, and self-determination, then we have to also be serious about our personal transformation. And so for people who consider themselves to be white, and for people of color, we're all impacted by internalized white supremacy, but that work has to be done. For those of us who consider ourselves to be men, male-born people, we have this work of ridding ourselves of patriarchy. And so that work has to go hand in hand with building this broader unity, because those are the things that prevent us from coming together and having this broad unity. Also, just as an example of that, I've seen something in this conference. The first day we had a wonderful opening plenary. And then on the same stage, immediately following the plenary, we had a dynamic panel of black women, and most of the folks who were in the room were gone. And I just want to point that out, because these are some of the impediments that keep us from building the kind of broad unity that we need. And also, it's been pointed out a couple times, the people who are most marginalized, who have the lived experience, who are the least protected, are the ones who have the answers. And so when they're on the stage, we need to be there listening. Okay, so that... And then also, as we're considering how we create more just food and water systems, as was said earlier, these things don't exist in isolation. And the reality is there's no food sovereignty unless people have sovereignty in general, right? There's no water rights unless people have human rights in general. And so we have to broaden our frame, and as people like to say, we have to be intersectional in our approach, because all of these systems work together. The food system and the water system is interconnected with all of those systems. And so while we might work specifically on those issues, we have to have a lens that is much broader and understands how all these systems are connected together, and how dismantling the threads that connect those things in a way that underdevelops people is an important part of our work.
So for better or worse, we're interdependent and interconnected. And I want to say, one thing that I think funders can really celebrate is that when you give community control over the decision, then you don't have to feel this paralysis of the weight of I have to get every single decision right, because now you're sharing the decision-making power, and that's a risk mitigation strategy. So as a lawyer, I'm letting you know that sharing power is a part of risk mitigation. And so I have two announcements. I don't know if they're challenges. I guess it depends on how competitive you are as a funder. But over the course of the work that I've been doing, I want to amplify one commitment that I've gotten from an anonymous donor, and that is for a fund that I'm hoping others will consider as, I don't know, a model, but it's called Upstanders. And that's Upstanders Fund is for the National Sustainable Ag Coalition, the National Young Farmers Coalition, Farm Aid, and the National Family Farm Coalition. So there are groups that are white-led groups who, in the moment of when folks weren't really sure what was going on with policies and whether folks should be filing lawsuits, those groups really centered their allies because they had been cultivating allyship with communities of color. Like, they didn't wait until January 20th to start considering, like, what does showing up in solidarity look like? And so because they had those trusted relationships, they were able to get, like, articles published with in the right places, and they were able to get, legal resources put together for folks. And so that's just, I just want to name that, I think sometimes the impulse could be to not know, like, what does allyship, what does solidarity look like in practice? And there are groups that have been practicing it, and that's a part of SAFSF's legacy as well, is their support of those groups. And then the second piece is an initiative that a group of anonymous funders invited me to make a menu. They were like, based on, you know, your legal work on heirs property and, you know, Black farmers, land loss, foreclosure defense. I graduated from law school right when the market crashed, and so I started doing a lot of foreclosure defense litigation, and I saw the mental health crisis that instantly happened in our rural communities. And so I feel like that's coming. I can feel it coming. And so I think it's really important that we get the resource ducks in a row. And so the suggestion that I made to these folks is a paper that I wrote. It's called The Safety Net for the Future of Village Farming. And it's just a reminder of the interconnectedness and the importance of what would it look like to seed solidarity economies. You know, we already know that, like, giving cash to people is like a really good, cuts out the middle, like, you know, management, but investing directly into communities. And so the village is what we have traded out for our version of consumerist capitalism. And so what are the ways in which funders can, you know, think about the transformation that will always be from the peoples on the ground, building those networks, changing the narrative, working together. And so I will be going on tour like Beyonce. And so if there are land projects that I'm going to be, I have a tour stop planned for every region of the country, but really I'm going around because I really want to call back into our communities that moment in COVID. It was when you just said the mutual aid, like, together we have it all. Together we have it all. When that first group of indigenous folks, they were reading off their credentials, I was like, damn, it was like a PhD this and a master's in this and that. And you know, there have been so many brilliant speakers here, and I really, I know I started off on a neg, but my call to action is that, like, we have it all. Like, we genuinely, like, that's why when I'm faced with that, you know, that harmful thought, I'm like, yes, like, we have it. I can hold on to the hope of knowing that I don't have to carry the decision making or the fear alone. Like, all of the things can be shared. And so I just want to encourage you all to lean into our interconnectedness.
Thanks, Dania. We are a little over time. I don't want to cut either of you off, but I will ask both of you to keep it succinct.
I just want to say this conference has been such a gift, and I wanted to build upon something that Dania said, and it's about showing up for each other. I was able to have a really great conversation with a fellow land-based person, farmer, and who does beekeeping and is a pollinator expert. I was like, you know what? I don't need to learn all of that. And she told me I don't have to learn all of water, but I'm going to show up for her when she has her project, and she's going to show up for mine. And it's all about that solidarity and creating the space to talk. And I think this conference helped make that happen. So thank you and gratitude to everyone.
I think the last thing that's kind of coming up for me is recognizing that we need to have more investment in the commons and in funding public goods and public infrastructure, including community-controlled assets, which is a form of public infrastructure when it's democratically controlled. But the funding of continuously of programs, of even individual vehicles and institutions and the 501c3s, it continues to have individual isolation and creating competition. So how do we actually get into a public goods mindset and moving things forward so that that's the way we take stuff out of speculation? right? That's the way you take out a competition. You're also competing in the market. You're competing with everything else. You're also competing with the natural world when we're starting to invest more and more into these isolated vehicles. So I think just a form of public infrastructure, and that takes a collective. It's not any one funder, any 5 funders. This whole room has to say, how do we develop public infrastructure for our movements and our communities?
Thank you. Take care of yourselves. We can do it together. Let's show up for each other, and let's invest in public infrastructure. I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you all so much for being here, sticking it out a few extra minutes. I think we are going to leave the stage. We're going to invite Claire to come to the stage to say a few more things to close the conference. But thank you all so much for sharing this afternoon.